Well, hello everyone. Thank you for your time and attention for joining us for today's webinar entitled Octopus 101, Getting Started with Octopus and Modern Deployments. My name is John Bristow. I'm the Community Director for Octopus Deploy, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today for this webinar. This webinar will feature a product called Octopus. Octopus Deploy is the company. You can find out more about us at octopus.com, and it will be about a 30-minute session featuring the product itself. We'll walk you through some of the concepts, the theory behind Octopus, etc., and we'll take a look at some of the things that you can do with the product. If you have any questions at any time, this is a live webinar, so feel free to submit any questions you have. You can do so using our Q&A pane. And also feel free to let us know in the chat where you're joining us from. So if you need to reach me, my email address is john.bristow@octopus.com. And feel free to let me know if you have any questions about anything that you saw during this webinar. I'm happy to answer them. In addition to that, I can point you to a number of resources we have available at any time. As I mentioned, we're using this webinar platform, which is live, for submitting a whole bunch of feedback. So you can send us your questions. You can send us emojis if you want. You can let us know what you think about the content. You can utilize the chat and the Q&A pane there for any questions you have at any time, which is great. The other thing worth mentioning is that we are recording this webinar, so you will receive a follow-up email at the end of this webinar telling you about a location where you can go ahead and watch this. So if you want to share this with your colleagues and let them know about Octopus, that would be greatly appreciated. Otherwise, you can check it out on our YouTube channel, which I'll point you to near the end of the webinar. So with that housekeeping out of the way, what I'd like to do is first, by kind of familiarizing you with what you'll be seeing in this webinar. So for some of you, this may be the first time you've seen Octopus, which is fine. That's no problem. We're going to go through it pretty slowly, but this is going to be a very hands-on webinar. We're going to do lots and lots of demos, and we're going to show you basically how the product works. We'll kick the tires, so to speak, and we'll talk about a lot of concepts. But by the end, my hope is that you'll have a good familiarity of Octopus. So some of the things that you'll learn in this webinar include how Octopus works and why you should use it. I think a lot of times when you look at technology, it's hard to understand kind of like the why. And so understanding the how is pretty easy. Like, we're all technologists and we all understand kind of like, ones and zeros are flying around all over the place. But why should I use a deployment tool like Octopus? That's a really important question. I'm hoping that by the end of this webinar, you'll have a firm answer in your head. The second thing I'd like to do is talk about some of the fundamental concepts in Octopus. So one of the things that we tout quite heavily is our model in Octopus. So what I mean by that is there are a lot of concepts that we introduce in Octopus to help you maintain and manage deployments. And so that model is going to be really, really important to your understanding of how you go about your deployments. And we basically describe a bunch of things, but by the end of this webinar, I'm hoping that you'll have a firm understanding of what that model encompasses. Now, every product is no different. They have their own terms of models, their own terminology, their own taxonomy, if you will. And so I'm hoping that by the end of this, you'll have a firm understanding of that. And if you don't, you can send me an email. Happy to answer them. The third thing you're going to learn in this webinar is how to create what's called a deployment process. A deployment process is basically the lifeblood of Octopus. It's what we do. It's basically the series of steps that will be taken for doing an automated deployment. And so a deployment is getting bits into the hands of your customers, basically. So a deployment process is really, really important, and we'll talk a lot about that, and we'll describe in great detail about how this works. And then finally, and this is where the modern deployments comes in, I want to show you how you can trigger a deployment through a CI process or server. We'll be using GitHub Actions as the example, but you can use any number of CI products that are out there. CI, by the way, stands for continuous integration. It's typically what we refer to as a build server. But a CI process is basically a process by which you build or compile, you generate a package, which is basically a binary distributable. And then from there, you may also run unit tests as well. But from there, you will then hand that package over to Octopus, and it will go about the process of executing a deployment process. So that is essentially the summary of what we'll be looking at this webinar. And as I said before, it's be a very high level sort of overview. That's why we're dubbing this the Octopus 101 series. But By the end of this, I think you'll be very comfortable with what you'll see here. So let's begin by, this is sort of like, in the beginning, there was software development. So let's start by talking a little bit about how software gets into the hands of your users today. So most folks will know that you have a group of developers working on code, and they're creating bug fixes, and they're implementing features, etc. And in their minds, or in the organizational minds, they have this series of way far away, in a galaxy far away. There's all this infrastructure that we want to either stand up and provision, and or we want to deploy to. And this infrastructure can be hosted services. This can be a wide range of deployment targets that we want to execute to as well. It basically, how do we get the software into the hands of users, which is kind of like what we're concerned about. Inside of this process, from left to right, there may also be a series of services that get involved. And I made reference to this earlier. This is known as continuous integration, which is basically a process by which your teams will continually exercise code through unit tests and through compilation and through all kinds of other means. The point of this is not to focus on that, but the fact that this exists is an important part of this process, because this is really where Octopus becomes involved. But what typically we see in organizations today is a lot of people combine CI and CD together, or continuous integration and deployment, in one product. And we believe that that's a problem for a number of reasons. But the least of which it would be the fact that CI does not really do a great job of deployment. If you take a look at a lot of the products that are available in the marketplace today, let's just pick one example, GitHub Actions, for example. Yes, they do support the notion of things like environments, and they support being able to deploy software, but the model is very fundamental. It's very basic. It's very primitive in terms of how you want to model deployments, and it doesn't do a great job to support patterns. You have to basically roll that out yourself, and so there's a contention there where a product like GitHub Actions does a wonderful job of doing tasks against code, but when it comes to deployments, it doesn't do such a great job, and developers and development teams often find themselves wrestling with the product to try and make it do what they want to do when it comes to deployments. And so obviously this is where a product like Octopus comes in. So Octopus is basically a deployment tool. That's all we focus on. We focus on basically getting bits of software onto deployment targets, whether it's infrastructure or customers' machines. And we have a model and a process by which we make that happen. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that are involved in making that occur, and that's part of what we'll take a look at here today. But just know that Octopus Deploy is kind of in between where code is compiled and tested, and then where it ultimately runs. And in that product, we have a whole bunch of things to help you manage the process. We have a feature called Runbooks, which will help you manage infrastructure. We have a whole bunch of things that can make it much simpler for you and your deployment, your deployments, and for your development teams going forward. So that's enough preamble. Let's talk about doing a little bit of a demo here. So I'm going to go ahead and switch screens. And all right, so what you should see on the screen here is Octopus Deploy. So this is the UI setup that we have for Octopus. This is the UI front end. Now, everything I'm showing you in this is serviced by an API backend. So every operation that I do inside of this UI, whether I'm clicking on these operations here, I'm performing operations through the UI, this is all serviced by an API. So we are an API first implementation of a product. What that also means is that we also have tools that complement this. So if you want to automate everything I'm showing you, you can. We have a CLI, we have an API. There's lots and lots of ways you can integrate your automations with Octopus. And that turns out to be pretty important, because at the end of the day, a UI tool like this will help you get the job done. But ultimately what you want to do is you want to automate this stuff. And so just know that when you're doing this, you have the ability to automate everything through scripts or through backend processes, whatever you wish. All right, so this is the UI, and this is the sort of first experience that you'll see with Octopus, which is the dashboard. The dashboard is sort of like your one-stop shop of seeing everything that's happening in flight. You'll see a list of projects, you'll see your various environments, and you'll see the various versions of that. Now, in this example here, it's very simple, but we're starting off simple and we're going to grow as we go into this. What I'd like to do is start by talking about spaces. So oftentimes when you're in a development team, you may want to segment away certain parts of your deployment processes, your permissions, your accounts access, for example, into different spaces. Spaces are a clean separation to basically isolate various projects from one another. It's kind of like a collection of projects, if you will. So it's a top level concept that basically gives you isolation. And so let's go ahead and create a new space, and we'll go ahead and call this Octopus 101. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a new space with a whole different set of managers and admins, etc. And when I do this, it will create a separate location for me to operate. So now if I jump into that space, you'll notice we have this empty environment. And this is the sort of first time experience you'll see with Octopus when using it for the first time. So one of the things that we've paid attention to in Octopus is to provide a better hands-on experience when configuring experiences. So this is obviously a first-time experience, and so we walk you through the processes. But when you get used to this, you'll be able to integrate with these very, very easily. I noticed that we have a question here. Let's just go ahead and make sure we highlight this appropriately. So is this the cloud service or the server version? That's an excellent question. So I'll just stop for a second and I'll switch over to here. So when you use Octopus, you can do so in a couple of different means. You can download and install it separately. So that's called Octopus Server. And that's what you'll see when you start a trial, for example. You'll see this sort of start a trial. You can sign up here and download a copy of Octopus and install it directly, or you can sign up for Cloud, which is our SaaS offering, which is the thing that I'm using here. So in this example here, this is using our SaaS-based offering. So you have the option of doing that if you wish, or you can use the server offering if you want as well. So great question, thank you. I love live questions. This is great. So all right, so jumping back to our cloud-based offering here. Let's go ahead and deploy. Let's set up a project here. So projects are the way in which I define my deployment processes. It's kind of like a unit of containment for various projects. So if I have, let's say I'm a company and I have a web project, for example, I may want to map that to a project inside of Octopus. You can do that one-on-one alignment if you want, or you can have a sort of an Uber project that contains everything for deploying to an application, for example. But basically, projects are the way in which we think about a collection of properties. So I'll just call this Hello Octopus. Now, inside here, you're going to notice there's another number of options. So the name is kind of semantically meaningless. You can call it anything you want. Obviously, you might want to align that perfectly to the way in which your group operates. But you have a few options here. The first option that you see here is this ability to use version control for the project. So this is a feature that we have that allows you to basically persist the values for this project to source control, namely say a Git-based repository. So if I wanted to say propagate changes to my projects in Octopus and persist those as a text file, for example, I can. This is a facility called config as code, and you can actually back up your project settings to a Git-based repository. So that's really nice. The other things I can do here are specify things like a description, a group, a lifecycle, etc. We're not going to get into this in a great detail because we won't have time, but we'll just go ahead and say save. Now, as part of this first run experience, one of the things we'll ask you to do is to set up some environments. So environments are the way in which you think about the ways in which you stage your deployments. So this is very typical within most development teams today. You'll have typically, a QA lab, for example, with dev and test and production. These and other environments you can set up. These are semantically meaningful to you as your organization. So they don't have to be named as such. You can call them whatever you want, but they are basically a way of thinking about how you go about your deployments. And there are consequences of your decisions here because as we'll see in a second, you can actually have stages of your deployment flow through to various environments. So I'm going to select the defaults here and click Save. So I've set up basically some environments here called Dev, Staging, and Production, which map to, as we'll see, a variety of targets, etc. So we have some environments, we have a project, and so now the next thing we have to do is set up a deployment process. And this is really where this is sort of the lifeblood of Octopus. This is where we define the series of steps that occur in Octopus to deploy software. So one of the things that we do is we provide an example, and this is based on a couple of languages, namely PowerShell and Bash. These are the environments that we can support. There are others as well that we support. But I'm going to go ahead and create one from scratch. So I'm going to create a process from scratch. And this is where we kick you into what's called a process editor. So what we're doing here is we're kind of like coming up with a recipe for Octopus to tell it, hey, when you go to deploy something, these are the series of steps that I want you to run. So it's going to do this, then this, then this, then this. And then at the end of that, your deployment will be complete. Now, deployments are more than just, take a DLL, an exe, a binary, and push it over to that server over there or to those customers over there. It can be a series of steps that include things like, hey, notify an administrator via Slack that we're about to do a deployment, or hey, send an email, or provision some infrastructure, or ask for a user to approve this deployment. These and other steps are what constitute a deployment process, and that's what we're constructing here. This deployment process is basically just like anything else you've seen in a number of wide-ranging tools that deploy workflows. So if you're using, for example, Kubernetes and you have YAML descriptions for workflows, or you're utilizing GitHub Actions, or utilizing any tools that describe a series of steps, this is no different than that. It's basically a series of steps based on a variety of templates that we have for you to construct these things. So you'll notice here we have a wide variety of choices here, and we basically compartmentalize or provide a taxonomy for describing these things. So if we take a look at some of these ones, I can run scripts, I can work with packages, I can do things specific to Google Cloud or AWS or Azure. We also have a series of community steps that are built in out of the box. So these are steps that we utilize that have been built by us or by members of the community that you can use for doing a wide range of operations. And as you can see, there's a lot of them. So if you're wanting to see a full sampling of what's available, you can either do so via the product, or you can go to library.octopus.com and you'll see a site that looks like this. This is basically the 500 plus community contributed templates that have been written for doing steps in Octopus. So if you're constructing by pieces a process, a deployment process, these are some of the parts and pieces that you can use. So if I want to say, for example, check what version of .NET Framework is installed, for example, I can go ahead and do that. And we provide a process for doing that. So these and other steps are available as part of our step template library. But we also have ones that are built by Octopus, and these are built-in ones. So let's start by making a very simple one. And this is by far the most popular step we have, which is run a script. So when I click on this step, I'll be taken into the editor experience for Octopus Deploy for a process. So this is running on a particular process that I have that I'm outlining. I can give it a name, and I can call this anything I want to just call this Hello Octopus, for example. I can give it markdown-based notes if I want. So these are the notes. And this is meaningful for examples where you're looking at a deployment process from a high-level perspective, and you want to give other members of your team some FYI notes if you want. Then from there, there's a whole bunch of sub options that I can specify. A lot of these we're not going to touch in this webinar today, but just know that there's a lot of knobs and buttons that you can push when it comes to defining steps and deployment processes. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and, as the example here denotes, I'm just going to execute a simple command, which is to output hello Octopus as part of this execution. Now, there's a whole bunch of options, as I said before, that you can specify here. I can specify that rather than defining this inline as part of a deployment process, I can actually make this part of my package that I'm shipping. So as I move from left to right, I can actually have part of my packages that I ship to Octopus, my script files that I want to execute. I'm not going to choose to do that, but I can do a whole bunch of things there if I want. We do support a variety of languages as well, so that's worth noting. When you're running a script, you can utilize PowerShell, but you can also utilize Bash, C#, F#, Python, etc. And then there's a whole bunch of other options here that we can specify. And I'm not going to go ahead and specify them directly, but I'm going to run this what's called on a worker. A worker is basically a little bit of software that will execute on a particular node, for example. I have this one that I have built in as part of Octopus Cloud, which is called Hosted Windows. And when I do this, it will go ahead and run that code on that worker. So I'm not specifying a deployment target here. There's a difference here. What I'm saying is there's an agent out there that's operating on my behalf, and I'm going to go ahead and run this code on that agent, or what we call a worker. Workers are really good for standing up for infrastructure, for checking connections, for example. You can think of it as like an emissary, if you will. It's sort of like doing things on your behalf. And this is useful in cases where, you want to connect to a DMZ, for example, or you want to connect to a partially or seldomly connected client, for example. And there's a wide variety of ways in which you can do this. You can set up what are called listening tentacles and polling tentacles, but we'll just go ahead and set the defaults here. And then there's a whole bunch of other settings that we can specify, but that's okay. We'll just go ahead and click on save. So when I click on save, now I've defined a deployment process, and I have everything ready to go to kick off a deployment. So let's go ahead and do just that. I haven't deployed anything yet. What I've done is I've just defined the process for doing that. So in order to do a deployment, I need to create what's called a release. Now, releases and deployments are a little bit different. So a release is essentially a versioned snapshot of everything that you've specified for your deployment. So the reason why it's versioned and the reason why there's a snapshot of everything is because there's a whole bunch of things that can come along for the ride as part of your deployment process. So there's things like variables, there's things like various settings that you want to propagate, versions of packages, for example. These and other things are snapshotted or saved in a particular state. And the reason why we do that is because as you evolve from one environment to the next, we want those deployments to be consistent. And by snapshotting those values, we know that it gives us consistency across environments. So if you're wondering, like, why are you persisting all that state into a persistent state, that's the reason why. So we do that for consistency and robustness as you cross environments. So we're going to create a release here, and we hide all these settings from you, but there's a whole bunch of things that you can specify, like release notes, and there's a whole bunch of the other things that you can specify as well. I usually start off with a very low version, just to note that this is a automated release. I can specify things like wildcards. I can specify all kinds of different version numbers as well if I want to do different incremental patterns. We do have that option. I'll go ahead and save this. And when I've saved this, what it's done is it's take a snapshot of, as I said, everything that has been persisted as part of that deployment process. So here's my release, and you can see I have a set of properties here. Here are, in some sense, we have our life cycle, but don't worry about life cycles for now. We have our various environments here. So we have deployment, staging, and production, which I set up. You'll notice that there are no packages associated with any of these steps, and that's fine. We're just going to go ahead and run this as an example. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that we are save as part of that. But let's go ahead and deploy this to our development environment. So when we're about to release, we've gone and pointed at the release itself, 0.001, and we're saying, okay, this is going to go to this environment called development, and we're going to basically specify when this is going out, so now as opposed to later. As part of our deployment process, we can also filter out any steps. So if there are some optional steps that we want to filter out or exclude, we can do so. You can also control this through other means as well. There are things like, variables and tags and all sorts of things, and tenants and all kinds of nice things that get involved. You can exclude and include steps as part of this. When we go to deploy, we can also use a feature called guided failure mode, which is basically when a error is encountered during deployment, Octopus will pause and allow you to correct the error before proceeding, as it describes here. So any errors encountered will result in the deployment failing. So these and other options are available to me, but let's just go ahead and click on deploy. Now, when I deploy, I'll be taken over to the task summary for this deployment process. So remember, I haven't done really anything too magical here. I've just gone ahead and run a script on a worker, and it says, hello, Octopus. And so we get this task summary. This other tab here will also specify a task log, which will also let us know what's happening under the covers. So any errors, any warnings, anything like that, any output that we have will get logged here and will allow us to debug the deployment process part of this step as well. So you can see I've gone ahead and deployed this, and it's gone ahead and completed. So you can see here, I've gone ahead and I've done my first deployment. So there's my message, hello, Octopus. And you can see that's very, very simple in terms of how we've gone about deploying this. So just to give you a level set, what you've seen here are a bunch of things, but what we're doing here is defining a very high level primitive example of a deployment process. We have another question here. So one could say that the process is like a pipeline in Azure DevOps. If you're coming from an Azure DevOps world, yes, it's similar to that. You're defining a series of steps to execute as part of a deployment. Now, interestingly enough, we integrate with Azure DevOps. So Azure DevOps is I would classify as a CI solution. They have a feature called Azure Pipelines, and Azure Pipelines allows you to define sort of a similar way of defining a workflow. I think of everything in terms of workflows. I mean, we're moving to a world where everything is a workflow. But Azure Pipelines allows you to use a series of built-in and custom steps to do work. And so with Azure DevOps, you can perform that work and then point to other services to do, other types of tasks. We actually have a series of add-ins for Azure DevOps or Azure Pipelines to integrate with Octopus. So the things that I did in this example, like create release and deploy, those are operations that you can invoke within Azure Pipelines if you wish. So you can call those operations within Azure DevOps. Now you might ask yourself, right, like I said in the beginning, why would I use Octopus as opposed to, say, I've got it all built into Azure Pipelines or Azure DevOps? Well, the reality is that, as I said before, those CI processes are really good at, CI processes like testing, unit testing, building, etc. But where they tend to fall down, where they don't do such a good job, is in deployments. And that's where our model really comes in. You've seen this, a few smatterings of that, examples of that. It's like tenants, channels, life cycles, etc. These and other sorts of concepts don't exist to a large extent in CI projects and CI solutions. They typically think of things like environments, and that's about it. They don't really have these concepts embedded within their products. And so more often than not, customers come to Octopus looking for a deployment solution because their CI products are letting them down. And so that's more of a long-winded answer. Sorry about that, Austin, but it's similar to that in terms of deployment process, yes. But it is different in the sense that you are defining this for deployments. So great question there. And again, if there are any other questions, feel free to let me know. So I'm going to mark this one as answered. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, any other questions, feel free to let me know. All right, so we're here in Octopus. We've successfully created a deployment process. We've executed that deployment process, and we now have the means for doing other operations as part of this process, which is always a good thing. So one of the things that we may want to do is we may want to deploy this to other locations, for example. So you'll notice here that I've created this release. I've deployed it successfully to deploy to my environment called development. And I may want to now deploy it to staging. And I can do so just very easily by choosing that and clicking on deploy if I wish. And I'm now evolving that deployment into staging. So this is basically the very manual process of deploying this to the next environment up the chain, if you will. But there may be some other reasons why I want to do things differently depending upon the environment. So the environments that I've specified here may have different requirements and different sort of operations I may want to execute. And so to understand how those things work, let's jump back into our deployment process here. And let's say add another step, for example. So there are a variety of other steps that I can run if I so choose. As as indicated here, I can perform a variety of operations. Like I can, deploy to an Azure-based endpoint. I can stand up infrastructure. I can run and execute steps like deploy to Nginx, for example. These and other sort of steps I can integrate as part of my solution. And I can also run these in parallel if I want. So there's a variety of other operations that I can conduct. Just to keep things simple, I'm going to go ahead and run another script step here, just to show you an example here of what you can do with this. So I can do a variety of operations for the step itself. So I can modify these. I can reorder these if I want to. Also, in addition to that, I can specify when these things run. So I can specify that these things either run if the previous step has succeeded or only run if the previous step has failed. So I have conditional statements within my deployment process. These are kind of like if then else statements, if you will, for defining a deployment process. I can specify options like always run or key these off when a certain variable expression is true. So a variable expression are these key off a variety of built-in variables as well as custom variables that you can define as part of your deployment process. So we define a whole host of variables as part of the environment of Octopus to control various values. We use a mustache notation we call octostash. So mustache is basically these curly braces that you see. And it's very popular in a variety of templating languages. We have our own called octostash. And you can use these for evaluations. You can do these for element lookup, variable lookups, etc. And so you can control the logic in which your process executes based on those values. You can also specify your own, which we'll take a look at in a second. I can also choose to say I want to run this step in parallel with the previous step. So if I want to run in parallel with the previous step, this will denote this in the process when looking at it from the process viewer. I can specify all the kinds of other requirements as well. We have new features as well to help with the robustness of deployments. So if I want, I can specify that I want to retry a step if it has failed. This is typically a good scenario to use if you have, say, flaky internet connections, like a high latency network to a remote site, to a remote deployment target, or some examples of like steps that don't work with remote services very well. You can specify retries. You can also specify a timeout period from where something is deemed to have failed. This is useful, again, in those scenarios where you have high latency networks. And what this is saying is it's telling Octopus after, say, 4 minutes, if this step has not successfully completed, mark it as a failure. So these and other options are kind of semantic in weight, and they tell Octopus, here's something else that you can do. And so these and other options are available to you as part of a deployment process. So you notice here when I mark this as a runs with previous, it actually says here runs in parallel. So you see that equal sign there denotes that. And so these and other types of processes you can easily wire up for Octopus execution. So that is essentially very, very high level, some of the concepts that you'll need to know when first starting out with Octopus. Now, you might wonder, like, hey, I'm setting up infrastructure and I'm provisioning it, Azure, and I'm setting up, all sorts of things. Where would I find those options to specify? We break those up based on the options you see up here. So when you click on the infrastructure tab, you'll notice this section here that denotes all kinds of things that are interesting to me. So for example, in my environments, which I set up earlier, there are also a whole host of deployment targets that I may want to specify as well. Deployment targets they range in variety and shape. There are other things as well that we can specify. Let's talk a little bit about deployment targets. So deployment targets are basically come in a wide shapes and sizes. So what we just ran was one for a cloud, what's called a cloud region, which is basically something that is provisioned as part of the SaaS offering, but there are other targets as well. So depending upon your operating system, you'll specify here what type of deployment target you wish to provision, or rather connect to. So if I choose on Windows, you'll notice I have some options here. So I can set up what's called a listening tentacle. I can set up either that or a polling tentacle, or I can connect to an Azure VM. These are options for when you're connecting to remote machines or deployment targets. So as an example, a listening tentacle is basically specifying an endpoint. Now, there's a lot of setup involved here, but it's pretty simple to set up once you have it installed on the deployment target. The deployment target is basically a designated target, like a web server that you want to connect to and deploy software to. And so the way that we set this up is through, if you want, you can look at the detailed sort of example here. But when we set up a listening tentacle is basically something that is receiving events from Octopus, and you can give it a name and you can specify all kinds of roles, etc. The thing that makes this secure is the communication setup that you see here. So if you're at all worried about how agents are communicating with remote locations, etc., you can set this up with an X509 cert that securely identifies the tentacle. We also make sure that the tentacle is configured by utilizing this thumbprint. This is all part of the setup process. So we ship tentacles separately, and you can download and install this. Once downloaded and installed, it will ask for these values for setting up that communication. And then once it's available, you can remotely connect to it very simply through this deployment target page. The other one is, as indicated here, is a polling tentacle. And this is useful where your environment isn't close by, or your deployment target has limited connectivity to Octopus server. And so a polling tentacle will allow you to specify where to go and communicate back to Octopus for instructions. And so it's just like it says, it's polling Octopus occasionally for work. So these are the ways in which you can connect to remote deployment targets. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we get into more elaborate example. Other environments that we support include Linux, Mac, and then we break down on a variety of other operations as well. So Azure, if you want to connect to a remote instance for, say, a web app, for example. We have also ECS for clusters there. Kubernetes is also another target available. And these are changes that we've recently made to Octopus. So this is more advanced. But if you want to connect to a Kubernetes cluster utilizing Argo as the sort of orchestrator for the Kubernetes setup, etc., you can go ahead and do that. Alternatively, we can also set up an agent within a Kubernetes cluster if you're all interested in doing it that way. And then finally, we also have what's called an offline package drop. What just allows you to do is specify a file share, for lack of a better term, a location for what are called offline deployment processes. So if you're wanting to remotely connect and then deploy packages this way, you can do so as well. So getting back to the scenario with Octopus, in this demo, you've seen how we've set up a space. So this is our sort of isolation boundary. We've set up a project, we've set up our environments, and we set up a deployment process. Excellent. So let's go ahead and just jump back to our slides here. All right. So just to recap, what you saw inside the deployment process really kind of highlights or articulates what you can do inside of the UI tool. So it's a visual representation of the deployment process, including conditions and things like child steps. As I mentioned before, we have integrated notes. Those are based on Markdown. You can do parallel step execution, which I showed you earlier, and you have things like environment labels as well. So another demo I'd like to show you is taking this a little bit further in terms of utilizing this with something like a CI process or server. And namely, I would like to use GitHub Actions as the example here. So jumping over to another instance that we have here, this one is connected to a GitHub repository. So inside here, this is available off of our public collection of instances called Octopus Samples. So if you go to /Octopus Samples, you'll find them here. These are all public. And in particular, the one that I'm interested in is something called Trident Flyway. I used this recently on a webinar. And inside here, we have what are called our GitHub Action workflows. So GitHub Actions, if you haven't seen this before, don't worry about it. It's basically based on YAML. YAML is a text-based format for describing a similar type of workflow. And it's based around code that you have hosted in GitHub. Now, if you're using Azure DevOps, that's fine. It's a similar sort of process. If you're using TeamCity, that's fine. If you're using Bitbucket, if you're using Jenkins, we integrate with all of them. So that's okay. You can certainly use those if you wish. And so just jumping over here, you'll see that this is defining a process. So there are two actions here that are defined. There is any push changes that we make to any one of these branches. Or if I want, I can specify what's called workflow dispatch, which is GitHub's way of saying, hey, I've clicked on a button, go ahead and invoke this manually. As part of this deployment process, and there's a lot of text here, so don't worry about that. But down here, you'll notice that we've created a set of actions for integrating with Octopus. So in particular, we can upload artifacts, which are sort of things like, the packages that as part of the packages that you're defining, you can upload those. You can upload packages or push packages to Octopus. These are the DLLs, the exes that you want to ship. You can also push what's called associated build information. Build information are essentially the SHA hashes and the commits that were done against your repo to auto-generate things like release notes and things of that nature. These and other actions are available for you to use, and these are available up on the GitHub Marketplace. So if you take a look at the Marketplace, which is available at /marketplace, and you search for Octopus, you'll see a bunch of the actions that we have available for you to use. So by defining these as part of a deployment process, you can then kick off deployments very simply. And so this example here is integrating with this instance of Octopus. So if we take a look at the deployment process, and again, this is fast forwarding to when you've gone ahead and made it a lot more elaborate, you'll see here that we have a whole series of steps that will run when we receive a deployment command or when we want to execute a deployment. So as an example here, you can see we have some steps defined in here, like performing dry runs. We have a step here, for example, for letting folks know on Slack that a set of changes are happening against the database. So if I want, I can set a Slack notification to, say, my DBAs saying, hey, we're about to change the database. We can perform other operations like, perform what's called a manual intervention. A manual intervention is basically like get a human involved and let them know that something's happening. You have to either approve or decline this step. And so this will essentially block the process from running until someone who is a human has come along and approved it. So these and other steps are defined as part of this process. And all of this is kicked off by this workflow in GitHub Actions. So when talking about, integration with CI and processes involved with building, etc., this is the integration piece here that provides that linkage. And so we've defined a whole workflow for unit tests, etc., for builds. But then when we want to deploy, we can define that as part of Octopus, and we define that process here. And as I said before, this is a more elaborate example, but this is keying off of all of those steps that I showed you earlier. And so I wanted to kind of show you the evolution of that and what that looks like. When looking at how GitHub Actions execute, you'll see a list of these running inside of GitHub Actions. And if you haven't seen GitHub Actions before, that's fine. It's very similar to other CI processes. So whether you're using Azure Pipelines, TeamCity, Jenkins, etc., they all do the same thing. They execute jobs or tasks, and those contain a series of steps, and those output to the runner, if you will. And so you can see here, I've executed this job here, and these are all the actions that I've taken as part of the execution. The part that's interesting to us in this discussion is where we're pushing information to Octopus and creating releases and deploying releases. These and other types of operations are the ones that we executed in the demo. So when I clicked on deploy to deployment or deploy to staging, it's essentially doing the same thing as that. And this harks back to the point I made earlier which is everything is based on APIs. So we have a CLI tool that you can use, or you can call directly if you so wish to invoke these operations. And so I'm creating a release, which is creating that snapshot of information, and then I'm deploying that release, and I can specify the environments that I want to deploy to, for example. So this is how we connect the two environments, GitHub and Octopus, together as this example. But as I mentioned earlier, we have a whole host of integrations with other products as well. And so taking this to another example, you can see we can do all kinds of different deployments depending upon your requirements. So we can, for example, start a Slack conversation, sending a notification to team members, hey, we're kicking off a deployment, let folks know. We can then generate a database change report if I want. We can then, integrate with IIS. We can deploy to IIS directly, our various applications, our backend services, etc. We can then promote to Azure. We can then execute database deployments, and then we can send an email at the end to our users saying, yep, this deployment was successful. Happy days. So I hope this kind of provides a very high-level summary. Again, this is a 101 sort of webinar to give you a summary of what's available there. But this provides sort of like kind of whets your appetite, if you will, of what's possible with Octopus. So if you want to find out more information about what's available through the tool, and also provide see some documentation of how this works, you can visit our website at octopus.com. We have this is the best graphic ever because it kind of describes what we're talking about here. So whether we're connecting to Bitbucket, TeamCity, Jenkins, GitHub, Circle CI, Azure DevOps, that flows in through to Octopus, where we define deployment processes. We set up environments. We set up things like we haven't had time to talk about, like things like channels and tenants, etc. And then those they eventually find their way over to infrastructure through deployment targets. We also provide case studies. We have detailed examples of things that are probably pretty important to folks, patterns like rollbacks, blue-green deployments, etc. And these and other sorts of information, if you're at all interested, are available up on our website. If you want, you can also visit our YouTube page, which is at /Octopus Deploy. There you'll find a whole host of videos talking about things related to Octopus and deployments. And we've been pretty busy talking a lot about deployments for databases and utilizing Kubernetes and using other tools, etc. There's the example with Flyway that I was citing in this demo. But these and other sorts of videos you'll find up on our YouTube channel. And we have a whole host of webinars coming up this month. You'll see some of the things that we're adding features to for tenanted deployments. Ian and Ships will be talking about that. We have a bunch of stuff coming around Kubernetes as well. So if you're at all interested, you can check that out at octopus.com/webinars. And I will go ahead and put that into the chat window. And if you want, also, you can check out our docs. We have a great set of docs at /docs. And the getting started section is where you're going to want to basically focus in on. Getting started basically gets you basically from crawl, walk, run, utilizing our samples instances, which I showed you earlier. And it will take you step by step through all the things that I showed you in this webinar. In addition to that, it will also provide you a whole host of examples. So this is available from our samples instance. If you're looking for a particular type of target, a particular type of pattern, we have a whole host of different patterns and target types supported through the samples instance. And then as you explore Octopus deeper, you have drilled down into each one of those topics. So when defining a deployment process, if I'm working with artifacts and packages, etc., we break that all down for you inside of our docs. And then finally, certainly last but not least, we have our community. So I would encourage you all to join our Slack channel. We have over 5,000 people there chatting about Octopus and deployments, etc. We also have a variety of other resources as well that you can check out if you're all inclined. And with that, I'd like to obviously thank you for your time and attention today. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer them now. This is always, we got a question here. Here we go. So I'll go ahead and highlight this. Thanks, Austin. All right, a little bit detailed. It's broken down a little bit differently in the chat window, but I'll just go ahead and highlight it here. So when I set up a deployment for an IIS website app/service, the process asks for an installation path and application pool, but the technical does the doing of copy files around. So what do I exactly set up on the deploy server? It feels a bit useless, or do I don't understand it correctly? Based on the guide, deploy an ASP.NET application to IIS using Octopus and Azure DevOps TFS. Okay. I'm not sure if I'm understanding your question correctly, but the technical does the work of copying files around. So what do I exactly set up on the deployment server? Well, Tentacle is there to receive messages from Octopus. Its job is basically to provide that connection. From there, you'll have to obviously provide the necessary process for setting up your IIS website app/service. I think this might be I'm sorry if I'm not answering your question, but this might be a good question to ask to our Slack channel. I know it's hard in a live webinar to kind of articulate all this stuff, but if you go to our Slack channel, there's an advice channel there, and it might give you an opportunity to provide better context there. So apologies for that if I can't answer your question directly. So what I get from that question is I'm having trouble deploying to IIS / whatever, and it's not working. I definitely see it feels a bit useless. The usefulness of Octopus comes when you have a deployment process that involves more than just pushing bits. So deployment processes involve things like patterns. They involve things like communication. They involve things like approvals. They involve things like, rollbacks, evolution from one environment to the next. So don't look at Octopus as just a means of pushing bits to infrastructure. It's more than just that. There's a whole orchestration involved in terms of getting software to services / people, and that happens behind the scenes. And so it's infrastructure as part of that process. And Austin follows up, no problem. Still thanks. Perhaps I don't understand the deploy server technical setup fully. That's fair. I totally understand that. So thanks for that. But yeah, the most important thing to note about Octopus is it's more than just pushing bits. It's about making these deployments, as we say, simple, reliable, and auditable. So we provide facilities. You saw the task log, for example. We provide facilities in Octopus to enable those capabilities. And these are things that are not always the simplest things to do inside a CI process or service. And that's part of the benefit of using a product like Octopus. Let CI and build servers do what they do well. Build software, generate artifacts, and then let Octopus handle deployments, because our model is far more extensive, far more powerful for doing that. And let me check the Q&A. No more questions. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time and attention. I really appreciate it. This wraps up the Octopus 101 webinar. We'll run these every month. And so if you're at all interested, you can go ahead and register for the next one once that's available. Just as a reminder, we'll provide a webinar recording of this at the conclusion of this webinar. And thanks for joining. We really appreciate your time. And we'll see you on the next one. Take care.